Welcome to Chapter 28 on Civil Wars, Liberal Crisis, and Conservative Rebirth. So let's get started. So liberalism at high tide. Great Society. Great Society, which pretty much started after Lyndon Johnson's re-election in 1964, was a focus on domestic programs including civil rights, poverty, and education. As you know, Lyndon Johnson became president with the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November of 1963. As he became president until re-election less than a year later, Lyndon Johnson focused on the Kennedy program of the New Frontier and what he was doing. So, what the Kennedy administration was doing, he kept his cabinet. After his election in 1964, Johnson's going to start going in his own direction. And one of the things that helped with the Great Society was that the tax cuts from 1963 exploded revenue for the federal government. So there was a lot of money to be spent. There was a lot of money there coming in, a lot of new money. Now you could say, well, there's Vietnam. Well, Vietnam hasn't completely crept up to what it was yet. So there's going to be a desire by Lyndon Johnson, who was considered or known as FDR's pet congressman from Texas in the late 30s. I believe Johnson got elected to Congress in 1938. It might have been 36. It's either one of those 2 years when he was elected to the House of Representatives. One thing that Lyndon Johnson wanted to do is redo and actually build upon the New Deal. Again, with civil rights, poverty, and education. Again, built on ideas and programs laid forth from the New Deal. Now, what was Kennedy's promise? John F. Kennedy promised health insurance for the elderly, anti-poverty legislation, tax cuts, and a civil rights bill. Health insurance for the elderly is going to become what we know today as Medicare. There are a lot of anti-poverty programs we're going to look at that's considered part of this Great Society. The tax cuts I already talked about. That was in his 1962 budget. And those tax cuts brought the marginal rate down from, I believe, 91% down to maybe 28 to 35%. I don't remember what the numbers were, but it brought it down significantly. As we talked about before, guys, there's a difference between marginal tax rates and what people actually pay. So those tax cuts designed to stimulate economic growth. And then, of course, a civil rights bill. And what John F. Kennedy helped demonstrate is the power of image. Okay? His image of youth, vibrancy, okay, promise, looking forward. He was able to put forth that image not only for himself, but for the country. There's a hopeful future. But at the same time, strong against communism, and a strong position in the world, but almost youthful in his outlook and hopeful for the future. So Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, LBJ became president in November of '63. He sought to end poverty. 20% of the country lived in poverty, much higher for African Americans and Native Americans for sure. I don't know what that percentage would be for African Americans. I would say in the mid-high 30s, if not more. The Economic Opportunity Act, okay, and Head Start, free early childhood education for poor students, Job Corps, and Upward Bound, which was for training and employment, and the Volunteers in Service to America, known as VISTA, which were more of a domestic Peace Corps. If you look at this, Head Start, okay, young children in disadvantaged neighborhoods will have free early childhood education. That would be preschool for poor students. That's a federally funded program. Okay, Job Corps and Upward Bound, again, I'm breaking these down, are training and employment programs for all people, Then Vista, you've taken the idea of Kennedy's Peace Corps and putting that to places in the country. And a lot of the focus of volunteers in service to America was to serve in underachieving neighborhoods, poor rural neighborhoods, and poor urban settings. There's a photograph there. The woman in the yellow is Lady Bird Johnson. That was the first lady, Lyndon Johnson, reading to preschool children, it looks like. I guess maybe a little bit older than that. So the 1964 election is important because Lyndon Johnson, less than a year after John F. Kennedy's assassinated, is going to be running for election in his own right. And his opponent is going to be Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater is a conservative. He wrote a book that was published early 60s called The Conscience of a Conservative. And that book there is considered by conservatives to be the original conservative manifesto or book about what conservatism in the 20th century meant. And basically what it meant is that freedom of the individual, and very, very, very critical, and believed a lot of the New Deal programs were unconstitutional. That the federal government, was way too much involved in the everyday affairs of people's lives. For instance, like the agriculture department and how farmers are paid not to produce. He had a whole section on that, on how the Social Security system is a system that will ultimately fail and not be able to provide its promise. There's a whole bunch of things in the Conscience of Conservative, and the whole question is, what role should the national government have in the everyday lives of Americans? Conscience of Conservative from Goldwater also wrote about states' rights and how states should have a lot of these powers. States should be dealing with education and anti-poverty programs and agricultural issues within their states. Goldwater will vote against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, not because he didn't believe in it, and this is from what Goldwater said. It's because he believed it was unconstitutional, that there was no constitutional authority for the federal government to ensure some of these so-called rights. Now, you may agree or disagree with him, but he had a very strict interpretation of the United States Constitution. He opposed the Great Society programs and advocated a tougher Cold War stance. It was more than that. Goldwater more opposed even the extreme New Deal programs, which will again get bolstered with Great Society programs. But understand, a lot of these Great Society programs at this time in 1964 were more proposals that haven't necessarily been put into law yet, or they were in the process of being voted into law. The Civil Rights piece of 1964 became law, but when it came to a lot of anti-poverty things and others, not quite just yet. Ronald Reagan is going to give a speech, and this says here, we need to fix this. He supported Goldwater at the 1964 convention. That time of choosing speech was not at the Republican National Convention. It was well after that. Ronald Reagan gave a speech live on television a few days before the election in 1964. And that's when the time of choosing speech was given. And Reagan laid the case for electing Barry Goldwater. The problem is that voters liked Reagan better than they liked Goldwater based on that speech. This is going to be the speech that's going to launch Ronald Reagan's political career. At the time, Ronald Reagan was just an actor. He was someone that gave a lot of speeches when he was an ambassador of goodwill, they call it, for General Electric. He would tour around the country, touring the GE plants, and then would go to these different dinners and these different events and give speeches. And his speeches more and more became about politics. Ronald Reagan was a Democrat until he switched parties in 1962. So up until 1962, he was a New Deal, and he evolved, of course. He was a New Deal Democrat, loved FDR, but over time, he became a Republican. because he was always, he thought in his mind, conservative when it came to government and taxes and things of that sort. So when he gave this speech in 1964, it was from the standpoint of being a former Democrat, a Hollywood actor, and then making the case for Barry Goldwater. The reason I'm going over this is a watershed speech for the conservative movement. Barry Goldwater is going to get killed in 1964. But a lot of historians agree that 1964 set the stage for conservative ascendancy, where Ronald Reagan will win the presidency in 1980. There on the top, there's a photograph of Lyndon Johnson, and then below is a picture of Goldwater. That's a terrible picture of Goldwater. I wasn't paying attention. I wish I had a better one. That's an awful picture of Senator Goldwater. And that's him after he ran for president. That was not what he looked like in 1964. So my apologies to that. So what are some of the Great Society initiatives? Okay. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, where it put $1 billion in federal money. This Elementary and Secondary Education Act still exists today. Some of you may have heard of Title I, where school districts that have more students that are on free or reduced lunch will get what's called Title I monies from the federal government. Well, you've heard the term Title I school. I believe Martin School is a Title I school. So it gets some Title I money. That's Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, where there's federal money going towards education at the local level to help districts that have children or students and families that are in poverty. Okay, it gets much more complicated than that. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act, I believe, gets reauthorized every 10 years, and they've given different names to it. Actually, No Child Left Behind under George W. Bush was actually a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 2001. So, another initiative, Medicare. Health insurance for the elderly. It still exists today, and it's been grown upon. The original Medicare was health insurance for the elderly, Medicare Part A, which is hospitalization, where hospitalization costs get covered. Hospitalization for the elderly in the later stages of life can devastate and bankrupt people and families. And that's what was happening, is that these costs would bankrupt the family. So the Medicare program was put together. It's a federal program. You pay your federal, what they call FICA tax or payroll tax, that pays towards your Social Security and your Medicare when you become of age. It's either early, you can take it early at 62, or then at the right time, or not the right time, but eligible time of 65. Then there's Part B, that is for, physician, going to your doctor, that kind of stuff. Then there's Medicare Part C, that you can pay extra money. It's called Medicare Advantage. I'm just talking about today. Then there's Medicare Part D, which was passed in, I think, 2003 or 4. That's the prescription drug program under Medicare that was pushed and passed under President George W. Bush. Okay, so I'm going a little bit ahead here to save time so you have a perspective that a lot of these Great Society programs still exist today. So I'm giving a modern example of it. Medicare has been expanded and built upon since its inception in 1965. Medicaid. It's health insurance for lower income individuals and families, also for those that are disabled. If someone is on Social Security disability, known as SSI, they're also eligible for Medicaid benefits. Since they're disabled and on SSI, it's going to be not assumed, it's understood that they can't afford to pay for their health insurance. So Medicaid is done through the states. It's a little bit different. Your Medicare benefits is a direct program through the federal government, where Doctors will bill the government basically for payments, and there's a payment schedule. Medicaid is what's called block granted through state governments. Massachusetts Medicaid program is called Mass Health. I'm sure you've heard of it, and it's been written about. It's in the papers. You may know someone in your family that's on Mass Health. Okay? In Rhode Island, it's called RICARE, R-I-CARE. Connecticut will have their name. The Medicaid programs, the money is put through the states where the reimbursement rate is 55% about that is paid for by federal dollars. The other 45% of Medicaid is paid for by the state governments. So you get a reimbursement rate of the cost at 55% on normal. It might be a little higher. It might be 57 or 58%. Now, the Affordable Care Act, or known as Obamacare, one of the things it did is that it expanded Medicaid coverage where states can opt in to cover more people through Medicaid. And what they said was, excuse me, the way we'll do this is that if you expand Medicaid to other people for the first 5 to 7 years, the federal government will reimburse it at a 90% rate. That means, so if it costs you $10,000 a year to provide a Medicaid medical program for someone that's poor and expanded, $9,000 of that will come back from the federal government. So it really only costs the state for the first 5 to 7 years $1,000. However, after that time is up, it goes back to the regular 57%. Now you're on the hook instead of 10% of the cost. The state is on the hook for 43% of the cost. And this is the big fear. Once this goes through, the Affordable Care Act is passed, and once this starts, you're going to see state budgets ballooning because their Medicaid cost is going to go through the roof. And 75% of the new people covered under the Affordable Care Act is from expanded Medicaid. And this is why a lot of people at the state and federal level are very concerned about the future of the Affordable Care Act, because most of the new coverage is expanded Medicaid. Massachusetts right now, 38% of the state budget, that means all the taxes we pay to the state budget, pays for Medicaid. Our version of Medicaid or Mass Health. It's projected that once these reimbursement rates go back to the normal, say 57%, that in Massachusetts up to 45% or more of every dollar that we put in the state government is going to be for Medicaid costs. Do you see what the problem is here? The question is affordability. There's some people that work jobs of working families now that are getting Mass Health. They actually work and they own a home and pay a mortgage and everything else, but they're actually getting Mass Health. The question is that the intention of the program or not? I'm not giving you a position. I'm not telling you what to think, but I want you to understand where Medicaid is going. So Medicare and Medicaid have both been expanded in different ways since 1965. Housing and Urban Development was a newly created department, and it built public housing. Housing and Urban Development has expanded. Not only that, they govern the rules of buying a home. When you go buy a home, the name of the form is called the HUD form, Housing and Urban Development form. Okay? So a lot of these public housing comes in different forms. The traditional stereotype of public housing would be a projects like Prospect Heights in Pawtucket or Chad Brown in Providence. A lot of them that tend to be urban and tend to be what's considered to be in tough neighborhoods. But other public housing could be low-income elderly housing too from the federal level. It isn't just your stereotypical, and again guys, lack of a better term, ghetto kind of housing. There's a lot of different public housing available. A lot of it's for elderly or low income. It's usually within those categories. Then you have the Immigration Act of 1965. It reversed what was deemed to be discriminatory quota acts of the 1920s. And it was discriminatory from the standpoint the immigration acts of the 1920s stopped a lot of Europeans from coming into the country. Not because they didn't like Europeans per se. Now, some people say that was the reason. But it was deemed to be that the nation needed to absorb 40 to 50 years of immigration previously, economically. That there wasn't a need for all the immigrants from Europe, and they just basically left it wide open for the southern border and within the Western Hemisphere. The Immigration Act of 1965 reversed those quotas, but not really. It actually gave preference to nations that were non-white. Now, when I say that, that sounds controversial. It kind of is. There was a concentrated effort that they wanted to give preference to those from other parts of the world, like Africa and Asia, that were traditionally not pushed out, but not really allowed to come in. There were some, and it was actually Senator Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts that was really behind pushing this bill. There was another senator, a Democratic senator, was behind it too. I can't remember who it was, but Ted Kennedy pushed it, and he outrightly said that, you know, that the racial makeup of the country needs to be changed in a sense, that the immigration shouldn't just be for all white people. Okay? I'm not saying this to be controversial. I'm just telling you that was the push behind this. And if you look at immigration law today, actually, there's no need to look at immigration law because we don't follow it. The reason we have so much illegal immigration today is we don't follow our own laws. We don't enforce our immigration laws. Okay? But this was basically to open the country to unrestricted immigration until now, for 52 years. There really hasn't been any change to immigration law, and basically the doors have been wide open since 1965. Now, some people say, hey, that's great. It's great for the country. It's great for everyone. You know, we're bringing in the world and all that kind of stuff. That's fine. But the other side of the coin is, has that helped real income for Americans? Has that affected the income of Americans? Has that affected the prosperity of the country? Some will say, well, we've needed immigrants for cheap labor. Okay. To be able to have your 99-cent hamburger and to be able to have stuff at your dollar stores. I get it. All right. The other side of the coin is, why hasn't real income increased since 1965? Some people will say it's because we had unrestricted legal and illegal immigration. If the quotas or whatever were made on the legal side, they came in illegally, and then the government has looked the other way. So the Immigration Act of 1965 is something that pro-immigration people point to, and anti-immigration or anti-illegal immigration point to as a watershed moment in immigration history. Because basically it just opened up the floodgates. Lack of a better term, not meant to be derogatory. But our immigration has been nonstop, wide open for 52 years. And the question is, can the country continue to sustain that? And that's a big debate that goes on in Washington today. There are some members of Congress and senators who are saying, we don't just have a problem with illegal immigration, we have a problem with legal immigration. Can we sustain all this legal immigration? Because no more did someone coming in have to say, hey, you know, I'm a scientist or I'm a teacher or bring a skill. A vast majority of our immigrants have come in the last 52 years have had low or no skill labor. Is that something that our country needs? Or is that something that the corporations need? Is that something what the government needs? These are the types of things I believe need to be debated. And I'm not going on one side or another, but the immigration issue is big or huge, as the president would say. Okay? So this is a really big issue, not only on the illegal side, but the legal side. And where it really opened up was the Immigration Act of 1965. Conservatives will say that the Democrats did this so they have more voters. That if you bring in immigrants from places like Africa and Asia, okay, which were kind of restricted, they're not going to vote Republican, they're going to vote Democratic. Okay? And people still say that today. That's why, the Democrats support illegal immigration and amnesty, because it'll get them more votes. Well, the Democrats will criticize the Republicans and their lobbying groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that they want unrestricted illegal and legal immigration for cheap labor. So there's a huge dispute between both parties. One accusing one, the Republicans accusing the Democrats, wanting more voters, as they vote overwhelmingly Democratic. And then the Democrats accusing the Republicans that, they go along with it because they want cheap labor and exploit labor and that kind of stuff. So, one thing I know, there needs to be some sort of solution this long term, and the country needs to decide what they want to do with immigration. So, I know I'm going way beyond on this, but I'm really stretching out to the into what period 9 issues. So, we're getting a lot of this being done right now. So, what did this act really do? It allowed relatives of legal immigrants to be admitted regardless of numerical limits, especially favored Asian and Latin American immigrants, and African too. So, a little bit later on. This is called chain migration. It allowed relatives of legal immigrants to be admitted regardless of numerical limits. It's called chain migration or chain immigration. And there's been a lot of proposals to stop this. There's Lyndon Johnson signing all these different New Deal these New Deal acts. There's the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So, assessing the Great Society, health care for the poor and elderly increased, with Medicaid for the poor, Medicare for the elderly. The poverty rate for African Americans decreased slightly. Poverty and segregation remained in many areas. Okay, another thing is that this war on poverty, something I read last year, the year before, something like $3 or $4 trillion has been spent on all of these New Deal, Great Society programs and poverty, and the overall poverty rate of the United States has gone up 0.1%. So basically, no change in 50 years on the poverty rate. Saw that. I think it was in 2015 or 2016 that I read that, and I found that very, very interesting. I don't know what the methodology was on that, but there's a debate. Has this Great Society actually helped poverty? Now, has it just made our poor richer in better conditions? Well, maybe. Maybe that's a good thing, that our poor don't live like poor do in some of these developing countries. So it depends on how you look at it. So the rebirth of the women's movement, you have labor feminists. These 1960s women sought equal pay for equal work and maternity leave. And that really hasn't been solved yet, because right now one of the big issues out there is equal pay. That was big in the 2016 election. Even at the local level, where there's a lot of state initiatives where, these equal pay initiatives for women and men to ensure that. Also, there's talk that the new President Trump, his daughter Ivanka, wants to push paid maternity leave. So these issues are still there since the 60s, for the last 50 years. In 1963, the Equal Pay Act, equal pay for equal work, that was at the federal level if you worked in the federal government. In other words, you get a federal job, men and women get paid the same for the classification of the job. In the 1970s, more women worked outside of the home. Then you have Betty Friedan and the National Organization for Women, or the acronym NOW. Betty Friedan wrote the book The Feminine Mystique, and argued that many housewives in suburbs were not happy and lived unfulfilled lives. That women were not happy with their roles of just being mommy and housekeeper. The birth control pill led to the decline in birth rates and the end of the baby boom generation. Birth control pill, from those from a moral standpoint, has been very controversial. The National Organization of Women for Women, modeled after the NAACP, is a civil rights organization for women. I would have to say, to be fair, the National Organization for Women and the NAACP favor more of a left-wing agenda. You don't see the National Organization of Women come out when conservative women are attacked in the press or attacked when things happen to them. That's an unfortunate thing that's real. Same thing with the NAACP. The NAACP did not come to the defense of Clarence Thomas, a conservative Supreme Court justice that you could say was brutally, savagely attacked in his hearings in 1990 or 91. I can't remember what year it was. So understand that the National Organization for Women is political and partisan. National Organization for Women is aligned with the Democratic Party, and so is the NAACP. They do not do business with the Republicans or conservative groups. Just to put it out there. It's not as a criticism, because they've done important work, but I want you to understand they're political. It helped bring attention to the lack of women in certain professions in politics. They absolutely have done so, but they've evolved to be a very partisan group. Same with the NAACP. So the Vietnam War is going to be beginning during this time too. You got a lot going on. You have the Great Society and the Vietnam War. Lyndon Johnson, because of the flush of cash coming from the tax cuts before Kennedy left us. For a while here, Johnson was able to, walk this tightrope again of being able to fund Vietnam escalation and the Great Society programs at the same time. But eventually that's going to go away in the late 60s, and we're going to go into a real economic crisis for quite some time. So Kennedy did not want to lose credibility by withdrawing from Vietnam. The first advisors were sent to Vietnam under Eisenhower. And remember, I've said this before and I'll say this again. John F. Kennedy was the coldest of cold warriors. He was even more intense than Eisenhower. I'd say right there, and even more intense in some respects than Ronald Reagan as a cold warrior. He did not want to lose credibility. If he pulled out of Vietnam, it would have been interpreted as being weak on communism, just as they would say that Truman lost China, okay? Just as would be said a little bit later on with Kennedy with some other problems with Cuba and things of that sort, okay? So, quote, I'm not going to be the president who saw Southeast Asia go the way China went. This idea of the domino theory, that if one country goes communist, the next country next to it's going to go. Okay? He didn't want to be responsible for that. He figured that would hurt him in his re-election chances in 1964. And again, he was a Cold Warrior. He was a veteran of World War II. He was a military guy. The Gulf of Tonkin. In August of 1964, there was a report that a U.S. ship was attacked in international waters by the North Vietnamese. And it gave LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, a reason to escalate the war. It's understood now he exaggerated what happened and ordered to use this to get what is known as a blank check. This Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Congress gave Johnson the ability to use any measures necessary in Vietnam. Essentially, it gave LBJ a blank check. So LBJ was able to conduct the war, was given war powers, without a declaration of war of Congress. A lot of Democrats are going to come to believe that he abused any measures necessary. And it's going to lead to a huge infighting within the Democratic Party in 1968. That, among other things, is going to tear the Democrats apart. And you could really look at the Gulf of Tonkin resolution as kind of the beginning of that. There's other things, we'll talk about it when we get to that. And then there you go. There's the Gulf of Tonkin. There's the area there of where the altercation took place at the time. So the new American presidents would be called Operation Rolling Thunder. It was a bombing campaign against North Vietnam in 1965. And more bombs were dropped on Vietnam than Europe and Asia during World War II. Understand, this is what happened. A lot of scholarship has even been done by psychiatrists and psychologists. Operation Rolling Thunder was escalated over time. The amount of sorties, that means the amount of planes or missions sent out to drop bombs, were gradually increased over time. And many psychologists believe is that the North Vietnamese slowly but surely got used to it and were able to adapt and had enough time to adapt and sustain this bombing. You see that? More bombs dropped on Vietnam than Europe and Asia during World War II. That is an unbelievable amount of bombs and bombing, okay? The other thing the North Vietnamese did is that they built an underground system of tunnels. And they would go underground and they would be able to sustain all the bombing because they lived underground. These tunnel systems were vast, went on for tens and 20s and hundreds of miles. It was unbelievable. Because the bombing was escalated over time, the North Vietnamese had the time to be able to build a resistance to these bombing operations. The North Vietnamese continued to resist and increase their morale because they were able to withstand this bombardment. Vietnam taught the United States that superior technology and weapons does not always win a war. You can bomb the heck out of anybody. They're underground and they're digging in without ground troops taking them. What good is it? I mean, if the United States was about to go over a lot of conventional bombing, I think we'd be able to figure out underground kind of stuff, just like England did from the Germans in World War II. So just because you have the technology and the bombs doesn't mean you're necessarily going to win. Unfortunately, when it comes to war, I'm talking about conventional war, which put nuclear war aside, guys. Hopefully that'll never happen again. Conventional war, ground troops are necessary to win a ground war. I don't care what anyone says, history has shown me that. And there's some sorties there of dropping bombs. A sortie, again, is a mission of a plane with ordnance. That means bombs to be dropped. It's called a sortie, S-O-R-T-I-E. Public opinion in the war. This credibility gap. Writers and journalists began to expose that the realities of the war were different than what the administration portrayed. Okay? The rise of the student movement. Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, founded in Michigan by students that sought social change. They came with the Port Huron statement. It criticized the gap between the rich and poor as well as the nation's consumer culture. And during this time, the new left is going to emerge. Different than the old left, it is associated with communism. Your new left, you would if you looked at videos from the Woodstock Festival in 1969, you would see tables of pamphlets and people will be wearing shirts of Che Rivera and other communists and pro-communist people and would be talking about the wisdom and the benefits of Marxism. The new left embraced Marxism. The new left still exists today. A lot of them are your college professors. A lot of your new leftists were elected to the United States Senate and elected to the House of Representatives and have served in the cabinet of the United States. Okay? I mean, I know I've said in class, guys, the political pendulum all the way, this political spectrum have shifted very left over the past 20 years, especially under the presidency of Barack Obama. Nothing personal, but he's pretty liberal. It's like far left. It's not the same left liberal of the 60s. This new left emerged in the late 60s because they were disenchanted with the Vietnam War. Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat, a liberal Democrat, they were not happy with that. And your college campuses even went further left than the elected people at the time. Eventually that's going to become, the new left is going to become the left, and the left that's in power. So you just need to understand that. It's just like the new right, the right wing when they've been in power, which is not, well, I wouldn't say that. Then when the right gets in power, they tend to moderate. When Democrats get in power, they tend to go harder left. Not meant to be a criticism, it's just an observation. Focus on gay rights, gender issues, and abortion. They also focused on more wealth redistribution. And what's the best way for to redistribute wealth? Redistribute wealth is to increase taxes on those that make more money and redistribute it to those that don't through programs. Okay. The book, or this PowerPoint here, tends to focus more on cultural issues like gay rights, gender issues, and abortion. It's way beyond that. It's also government spending, pacifism, like the communists would be more pacifist, not getting involved in foreign wars and things of that sort. Again, I'm not calling the New Left communism. There's a difference between associating with communism or being more Marxist in nature. Doesn't mean it's communist. University of California, Berkeley, and the free speech movement. Students sought to use universities and public spaces for protests and organizations. But the protests in these organizations tended to be left-wing. There's a big controversy right now at UC Berkeley where, more right-wing or conservative people have been attempting to speak at UC Berkeley, and the college has been canceling those people. And they're supposed to be the college for the free speech movement. So there's a little bit of hypocrisy there, but there's been a lot of pressure put on UC Berkeley lately too. And they've been somewhat reversing things over there. The Selected Service, or known as the draft in 1967, banned automatic student deferments and increased protests. Just because you're a student does not mean you're going to get deferred from the draft. That means if you are a student, you can still be drafted. And it not only increased protests, it increased people burning their draft cards, and a lot of people even went to Canada, went overseas, so they wouldn't be drafted. It's a little bit more than protests. The Young Americans for Freedom is a conservative group. It was a conservative response to the New Left. The Sharon Statement, written before the Port Huron Statement, inspired many conservatives. Then there's the counterculture. Our friends the hippies, inspired by folk music, later the Beatles, Rolling Stones, etc. Bands like the Grateful Dead. I guess you could say Janis Joplin, even though it was blues-based, it was more hippies. Country Joe and the Fish transferred more to a hippie kind of band. Okay. They rejected many values of their parents' generation. They used drugs, marijuana, and LSD in particular, and helped introduce a sexual revolution. And that can be personified in, if you watch the original footage of Woodstock. There's some hippies. So the Days of Rage, 1968 to 1972. You have War Abroad and Tragedy at Home. The Tet Offensive. On January 30th, 1968, which was the Vietnamese New Year, there was a surprise attack by the North on South Vietnam. Although the North was defeated, it was a watershed event in the war. Many began to see the war as unwinnable, and protests increased drastically throughout the country. And there's a picture there of protest. Get the hell out of Vietnam. So, Tragedy at Home. Political assassinations in the year of 1968. 1968, if you really look at it in American history, was a horrible year. The protests in Vietnam became pretty intense, violent, clashes between protesters and police and law enforcement, and then these political assassinations. The year of shocks. First, the Tet Offensive really shocked people that, this war is going to be brutal. This is no longer, we're assisting the South Vietnamese. We're looking at a lot of casualties, a lot of problems, that what we're being told, what we've gotten ourselves into is a lot more bigger than what it is. A lot more bigger than what we were told, So on April the 4th, 1968, as you know, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, and it led to riots in many cities, over 100 cities, I believe, in the United States. It was believed that, white supremacists had this done, but it looks like that James Earl Ray was a lone wolf kind of crazy guy. June 5th of 1968, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, former Attorney General, was killed in the midst of the Democratic primary. He ran for the Senate in 1966. New York, was elected as a senator. Then in 1968, he jumped into the presidential race after Edwin Muskie won. Was it Muskie? No, it wasn't Muskie. Who was it in 68 won the New Hampshire primary. That's an Irish last name. It doesn't matter. So then he jumped in. The funny thing is that Robert F. Kennedy helped John F. Kennedy orchestrate the increase in troops in Vietnam. But then in 1968, he runs as an anti-Vietnam War candidate. He wasn't going to win the nomination. Vice President Hubert Humphrey under LBJ had this locked up. Back then, there was still a lot of the delegates were selected outside of the primary system. However, RFK won the California primary on June the 5th. He went to the Ambassador Hotel, where his overall party, victory party was. He gave a speech. And what's customary a lot of times when you go give a speech in a room, when you leave, you don't leave through the front of the room. There's too many people. So his exit out was through the kitchen area. So you go in the back from the room at the hotel and you go through the kitchen area. Here's a picture here just before RFK was killed. He's there introducing himself to the cook and wait staff that's working in the kitchen at the hotel. And so he was walking through the kitchen, and a man named Sirhan Sirhan shot him point blank. I believe he didn't shoot him in the head. Shot him in the torso, chest, and stomach area. And I decided not to put any pictures of him laying there after he was shot. That was in June the 5th, 1968. He was shot and killed right after that. He won the primary. And that was it. And that was the big shock to the country. The anti-war movement in the 1968 election, you're going to see here, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago is going to be a disaster. Demonstrations outside the convention were broken up by police with clubs and tear gas. And if you look on the left here, here's some demonstrators. Most of them were demonstrators of the Vietnam War. Okay. And then you look to the right, there is Hubert Humphrey and his running mate there. I can't remember who his running mate was in 1968. We'll look that up. Richard Nixon was going to he's going to make his comeback and become the Republican nominee in 1968. He focused on northern working class workers and southern whites. George Wallace was another candidate, advocated law and order, ran as a third-party candidate on a segregationist platform. Wood's Nixon strategy was the Southern strategy, sought to gain the support of whites in the South. Outspoken and against the anti-war movement, urban riots and protests. The election of 1968, white Southerners began to abandon the Democratic Party. It was for a lot of reasons. A lot of history books like to point to, all because of, the civil rights bills and things of that sort. Well, civil rights bills passed with Republican votes, Republican majority votes in both houses. So to become Republicans doesn't really make that much sense. But another analysis of that could definitely be is that the Democratic Party became more liberal, or more, for higher taxes and for more government programs. Medicare and Medicaid was controversial. A lot of people seen that wasn't really an overall role and responsibility of the federal government. A lot of the New Deal programs that had to deal with anti-poverty programs, a lot of people in the South, conservatives, believed that was a state responsibility, not a federal responsibility, and all this spending. So you can look at how white Southerners begin to abandon the Democratic Party in different ways. But unfortunately, certain books will just say, well, it had to do with, race. That's not a fair assessment of it, because again, Republicans supported almost 80% of the Republicans in 1964. More than that, I think 90% of Republicans in both houses supported the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The resistance were from Southern Democrats. So to say that these white Southerners went to the Republican Party, I don't think that completely holds water. I mean, in some instances, sure. But no. And there's Richard Nixon, and there is George Wallace. And then here's the 1968 election results. You'll see that Nixon's going to win the election. It's pretty close. Nixon will win in New England. He'll win New Hampshire and Vermont. Believe it or not, Vermont used to be a reliable Republican state. So did New Hampshire. New Hampshire, I don't think, has voted Republican since George H.W. Bush. Maybe did George W. Bush win New Hampshire once? He might have. So, and then you'll see Wallace is going to win in the Deep South with Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and get one electoral vote in North Carolina. So the Southern strategy is going to work for Nixon in South Carolina, Tennessee, and Florida. But part of that you got to remember too is that Wallace took votes away from Humphrey in the South too, and gave Nixon a plurality. So there's going to be a nationalist turn. The Chicano Moratorium Committee, the Mexican Americans protesting of the Vietnam War. So there's going to be a turn where nationalist means is that what about our problems at home? And a lot of these groups will be like the Chicano movement, the civil rights movement, in other words, well, what about the plight of African Americans? What are the problems with Latinos or Chicanos? What about the problems with Native Americans? They argue that the draft hurt the poor. Okay, a lot of this rich versus poor thing had to do with, well, more poor people are being drafted, not rich people. Women's liberation, feminists tended to be younger, educated, and associated with the civil rights and anti-war movements, not tended by younger. Okay. Some radical women sought to gain feminist goals through politics and sexual politics, advocated that women must have control over their bodies in order to shape their destinies. Focused on access to abortion and awareness of sexual assault and sexual harassment. Title IX in 1972 banned discrimination in higher education based on sex, and federal funds would be cut off. Title IX changed high school and college athletics, where athletics were geared towards males, and there weren't a lot of athletic opportunity for women. Gloria Steinem helped create the National Women's Political Caucus and helped sponsor legislation promoting equal rights. And in 1974, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act allowed married women to gain credit cards in their own names. Some areas that was not possible. Remember, going all the way back, that women basically were an extension of their husband. The husband was the one that was the creditor, or was the one that was getting the credit. You have the Stonewall and gay liberation. Homosexuality remained illegal in many states. The Stonewall Inn incident, where it was a gay bar in New York City that was raided by police. It led to riots over a 2-day period, and it was the birth of the modern gay rights movement. And then Richard Nixon and the politics of the silent majority. Nixon's belief that many Americans supported his beliefs and the war, that there was a silent majority that wasn't out there protesting and being loud, but supported what he was doing. Nixon in Vietnam, his policy was to gain peace with honor. Nixon sought to end the Vietnam War, but only in a satisfactory way for the United States. So Vietnamization and then Cambodia. What is Vietnamization? Is the gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam by being replaced with South Vietnamese troops. This same thing was started under George W. Bush after there was the surge in Iraq. Then there was a process where they were trying to pull back troops as Iraqis will be able to take those responsibilities. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, when the Obama folks got in, they pulled out really quick. They abandoned that approach. In April of 1970, the U.S. began bombing supply lines and bases in neighboring neutral Cambodia. This led to many protests on college campuses, most notably Kent State. In defense, you need to understand that the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese, or the Viet Cong, they were using underground networks to move weapons and supplies through Cambodia and then into South Vietnam. The reason Cambodia was bombed is because the North Vietnamese were transporting their weapons through networks in Cambodia. Now again, none of this went before Congress. This was seen as an expansion of the war. But it needs to be noted that the North Vietnamese were going into Cambodia to get stuff into the theater or the battles within South Vietnam. The My Lai massacre, execution of over 500 South Vietnamese women and children. Okay, that was obviously very, very controversial. And to this day, there are those that say that what happened in My Lai was over-exaggerated, isn't exactly what happened, and it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. There's still a lot of bitterness over that. And then there's some pictures of the My Lai massacre. Overall, though, it's pretty tough to see on TV and in pictures that you have women and children being massacred. Not good. Detente. What was detente? So what else is going on? Yeah, you have Vietnam. You've got all these things, but you still have the Cold War going on with the Soviets. Not only with the Soviets, but with the Chinese. And how are you going to deal with communism and the attempted spread of communism and Marxism throughout the world? So what is detente? The easing of Cold War tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Okay, it was seen as more conciliatory to I guess, lack of a better term, Soviet or Chinese aggression. So you ease the tensions by being a little bit more, I don't know, practical or not so resistant to what the Russians or the Soviets and the Chinese are doing. And this led to the SALT I, which is the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. It was signed by Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev, who was the premier of the Soviet Union at the time. He succeeded Nikita Khrushchev. On February 21st of 1972, Richard Nixon is going to visit China, which is, I believe, the first president ever to visit China. China, for years and years and years, closed themselves off from the rest of the world. And this was meant to normalize relations with Communist China. It was also a Cold War calculation, too. Nixon sought to gain an advantage over the Soviet Union and help end the Vietnam War. He wanted to split up this, the Soviet-Chinese axis. One way to defeat communism, Nixon believed, along with his Secretary of State and National Security Advisor before that, Henry Kissinger, would be to divide and conquer the two major, not conquer, but divide the two major communist threats or adversaries, which would be the Soviets and Chinese. Okay, that's why this was done. Exit America. In the election of 1972, Nixon campaigned on peace at hand in Vietnam. January 1973 will be the Paris Peace Accords that will, in essence, end the fighting. 58,000 Americans died and 300,000 were wounded. Vietnam had an enormous cost in the United States, not only militarily, but politically, because the public showed they did not support this war, and it's proven if the American people do not support a war, you can't win it. The United States lost Vietnam. In 1975, the embassy in Saigon is going to be taken over, and that's going to be the end of it. The North Vietnamese are going to take the South. It's going to be a loss. It's going to be a failure. Now, detente, when you look at the top here, detente was controversial. There were conservatives that said detente is appeasing the Soviets. Detente is appeasing communism. And detente is a sign of weakness. So detente is going to be controversial. However, Nixon and then later on President Ford and Carter are going to say, look, you got to be realistic of what the world is. Do we really want to get into conflict over this, or do we learn how to kind of ease tensions here and do that from a position to negotiate some limitations on nuclear weapons and things of that sort? There's Nixon and Brezhnev at SALT I. And then there is Nixon, I believe that's Ho Chi Minh. I think he was still alive in 1972 in China. The silent majority speaks out. Law and order in the Supreme Court. The Warren Court from 1954 to 1969. They were accused of legislating from the bench. Rights of the accused increased. Okay? What does legislating from the bench mean? Creating law from a ruling. In other words, a ruling's not based in law. A ruling, a Supreme Court, or a court ruling creates new law, like Roe versus Wade, which was the case that essentially made abortion legal in the United States. There's never been a law passed in the United States Congress that's legalized abortion. The way it became law is by the Supreme Court saying that it's illegal. Saying it is legal to have an abortion. We go Miranda versus Arizona. People must be made aware of the right to remain silent. This is the Fifth Amendment. Okay? You have the right to remain silent. I think you can't say will be used against you in a court of law. You have a right to an attorney. You can't afford one, an attorney will be provided to you. That is the Miranda rights that are read to you when you're arrested. Hopefully none of you are. Comes from this case, Miranda versus Arizona. Sanctioned religious practices in public schools were prohibited, this Warren Court. The growth of suburbs helped increase segregation in the North. Cities, more minority, non-white. Suburbs, white. And there is the Warren Court. Busing. In the 1950s, schools were ordered to desegregate with all deliberate speed. As of 1968, 1/3 of Southern blacks attended integrated schools. The other 2/3 didn't. They're still segregated. By the mid-70s, 86% attended integrated schools. And how did they do this? Busing was used by the courts to decrease segregation. And these photographs you see here from Boston. One of the most controversial areas for busing was in Boston, Massachusetts, where African American students were sent to high school in Irish South Boston. And the South Boston Irish Americans freaked out. You see here police presence and everything else. It's very tense for busing in Boston schools. The growth of the suburbs helped increase segregation in the North. Again, that's repetitive. The 1972 election, many Southern whites switched to the Republican Party. Again, many reasons for that. Some will say because of the racial component. I don't buy it. I think it's more because the Democratic Party became more liberal, more big government. And again, nothing against it. It's just a different way of doing it. A lot of Southerners are more for that state rights limited government thing. It isn't all racial. Were there some because of race? Of course. Nixon is up for re-election versus Senator George McGovern from North Dakota. A very liberal senator, anti-Vietnam War senator. McGovern's never going to get his feet off the ground here. His running mate's going to have to change. First it was Eagleton. It found out that Eagleton had shock therapy, on his brain, was under the care of a psychiatrist. Said, oh, we can't have that, so he gets dumped from the ticket for Sergeant Shriver. And so the McGovern campaign's never going to get anywhere. Nixon's going to win in a landslide. You'll see here he won every single state except for Massachusetts. He even won George McGovern's home state of North Dakota. And then the only other place McGovern won was the District of Columbia. Okay? Nixon completely obliterated McGovern. So a quick recap. Great Society, the Immigration Act of 1965, Betty Friedan Now, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, the Counterculture, the Tet Offensive, increase in domestic protests, the 1968 shocks, the Big Three, Tet Offensive, MLK, RFK assassinations. We'll add in the Big Four, the Democratic Convention, which kind of is an explosion from all of that. Okay, Vietnam, the assassination of big-time leaders. Yeah. Title IX, where women in colleges and education and schools and everything else, there needs to be equal footing on that. The Stonewall riots that starts the gay rights, lack of a better term, not a revolution, but movement. Remember, homosexuality was illegal in many, many states. It was against the law. Vietnamization, where as there's victories, American troops will slowly but surely get replaced by South Vietnamese troops, so there won't be the need for American troops anymore. Détente, again, bringing down tensions with the Soviets, but again criticized as being too nice to the Soviets and being too nice, nice isn't right, appeasing communism and appeasing the Soviets and the Chinese. The Warring Court, which was very liberal on a bunch of different levels. And that is it. Again, if you have any questions on Chapter 28, please bring them to me. If not, until next time.